Let me start off this episode with a little quiz. Which war almost started because of a pig? Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. Okay, so in 1859, the United States and Great Britain almost went to war over an archipelago of islands located in the Pacific Northwest, an area known today as the San Juan Islands. This conflict, which would become known as the Pig War, nearly escalated into a broader international incident that could have very well altered the course of the 20th century. So let's talk about it. In the early 1800s, both the United States and the British Empire laid claim to the Oregon Country, a vast region of land that encompassed present-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of British Columbia and Alberta. The British based their claim to the region on a series of vague and outdated trading agreements that they had made with various First Nations tribes, while the Americans based their claim on the concept of manifest destiny. Whatever the case, these competing claims led to the Oregon boundary dispute, a point of contention that almost resulted in war between the two nations in the 1840s. However, cooler heads prevailed, and the two sides were able to come to an agreement that settled the dispute. The border between British and American territories was set at the 49th parallel, with the exception of Vancouver Island, which remained under British control. And while this settlement did diffuse the situation, it also left one small group of Americans feeling rather jilted. See, since the late 1700s, American settlers had been moving into the area around present-day Washington state, and by the time the Oregon Treaty was signed in 1846, several hundred Americans had settled on Vancouver Island. While this influx of American settlers did not go over too well with the British, it wasn't really much of a problem for the U.S. government. In fact, American leaders like President James K. Polk didn't even know about the settlements until after the treaty was signed. At the time, there were only 3 ways to get to Vancouver Island from the rest of the United States, all of which required lengthy and difficult journeys via sea. And so the American settlers on the island basically became an isolated colony without any real way to communicate with the rest of the country. And by the 1850s, many of these settlers began to feel that they were being unjustly denied U.S. protection. They were still technically American citizens, but they were beginning to wonder just how long that would continue. Then in 1859, a pig would come along and help answer that question. In June of that year, an American resident of the San Juan Islands shot and killed a British-Canadian mounted police officer named Rogers A. Manson. As far as the story goes, the incident happened after an argument broke out between some American settlers and the local Hudson Bay Company agents over grazing rights. The American settlers argued that the company was illegally restricting their access to common grazing lands. But when the argument started to heat up, the company sent for backup. In came Manson, who was working as a police officer for the Hudson Bay Company at the time. But as he tried to calm down the crowd, things got out of hand and an American settler shot him dead. Now, as you might imagine, this event did not do wonders for Anglo-American relations. Even though the American commander in the area wanted to arrest the man who shot Manson, the British began demanding that the U.S. government intervene and punish the perpetrator. And since there was still lingering resentment over the Oregon boundary dispute, the British were preparing for the possibility that the Americans might just say no, and so they began stationing troops on Vancouver Island. Soon enough, the British and Americans had amassed over 800 soldiers between them on Vancouver Island and the San Juan Islands, and everyone was starting to get pretty nervous. It seemed as though war between the two nations was imminent, and the whole thing had almost entirely been caused by an argument over pigs. Well, luckily for everyone involved, cooler heads eventually prevailed, and the situation diffused. And while this conflict never escalated into a broader war, it is important to remember that this was taking place during a time of significant political upheaval across Europe. The Franco-Prussian War had broken out in 1870 and had ended just 3 years before the Pig War. Meanwhile, the Congress of Vienna had been undone by the revolutions of 1848. And while these conflicts themselves did not lead directly to the outbreak of World War I, they did play a part in destabilizing Europe and creating a climate of suspicion and antagonism. And as such, the last thing that the continent needed was another major international incident, especially one that might drag them into another costly war. And yet, That's exactly what almost happened. Now, going back to the Pig War, the situation began to unravel when an American minister named James Robertson traveled to London to try and negotiate a peaceful solution with the British government. Unfortunately, his mission was a failure, and he soon returned home in disgrace. To make matters worse, pro-slavery activists in the United States began agitating for the start of the Civil War, arguing that the controversy over the San Juan Islands was proof that the British were hostile towards the United States and were trying to provoke them into war. To make matters even worse, the pro-slavery advocates argued that if the United States didn't take action over the islands, then slave states like Virginia and Mississippi would likely leave the Union and join the Confederacy. And before long, it seemed as though the Pig War might escalate into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Then in August of 1859, everything changed. On August, a group of American settlers and U.S. Army troops arrived on San Juan Island to reinforce American claims to the territory. They built Fort Casey at the site of an old American trading post and began calling the island theirs. Meanwhile, the British responded by sending a delegation to the island to tell the Americans to pack up and leave. But when the British reached the island, they discovered that the Americans had already fortified their position and were prepared to fight, and so the British were forced to back down. Then, just a few weeks later, a member of the British House of Commons revealed that the British government had secretly purchased the southern part of Vancouver Island from the Hudson Bay Company. And once this news broke, it became clear that the British were not interested in pursuing a conflict with the Americans. If anything, the British now had even less of a reason to fight over the San Juan Islands, and they began drawing down their forces on Vancouver Island. Soon enough, the diplomatic crisis had passed and the Pig War was over. However, it's important to remember that this conflict took place at a critical moment in world history. In Europe, the alliance system was rapidly developing. The Austrian Empire was making moves to reassert its power in the Balkans, and Germany was quickly becoming a formidable military power. And while none of these developments had yet come to a head, the Pig War demonstrated just how quickly things could change. Had the British decided to fight over the San Juan Islands, it's very possible that they may have dragged the United States into a wider European conflict. And given the fact that the British were still fighting against the Boers in South Africa at the time, they likely would have lost. And so while the Pig War didn't lead directly to World War I, it did serve as a warning for both the British and the Americans that diplomacy was in their best interest. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please consider commenting below to let me know what surprised you the most about the Pig War. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, be sure to check out my other videos and subscribe if you enjoy history. Thank you.